So this company was founded in the 1980s, but for most of American history, prisons were meant to turn a profit. So after I did this undercover investigation, and I went to work on this book, I realized that to really kind of tell the story of for-profit prisons, I had to go way back, further than the 80s. And I went all the way back to the American Revolution. And so the way that the book is kind of laid out is I tell the story of my time undercover in alternating chapters with the history of American prisons, American for-profit prisons in particular, and trace the kind of evolution from the very beginning of prisons to the present. And I found that throughout American history, prisons, really until the 1970s, prisons, especially in the South, were turning a profit either for private companies or for the state. And so here in Louisiana, the first prison was opened in the 1830s, and Louisiana was one of the first places ever to privatize its penitentiary. It privatized its penitentiary in 1845. It was in Baton Rouge. It was opened, and but to give some context about the opening of this penitentiary, this was a time when the South, there were no penitentiaries in the South. The idea of the penitentiary was still new. They started in the Northeast. They were invented here in the United States. And the South was resistant to the idea of penitentiaries, partially because they were associated with abolitionists, slavery abolitionists, because slavery abolitionists tended to be death penalty abolitionists, and the penitentiary was, at the time, a reform. The idea was, instead of executing somebody for theft, you sentence him to some years in prison. And the penitentiary was kind of a threat to the white supremacist ideology of the South, because the norm of penitentiaries that existed in the North was when somebody went to prison, they were forced to labor from dawn to dusk. And if the South had opened penitentiaries, the people who went to them would mostly be white, because African Americans at the time were mostly slaves and were punished on the plantations. And white people would be forced to labor. What convinced Louisiana to open its penitentiary was learning that the penitentiaries in the North were actually making money for the state. They were bringing in profit from their labor. The labor in the prisons in the North were contracted to private contractors, and they were adding money to state coffers. So the Louisiana opened its penitentiary. It was essentially like all penitentiaries at the time. It was a factory. And the Louisiana and other states in the South kind of saw it as a penitentiary as a way to help industrialize the South and take kind of the northern monopoly on industry and bring it south. And shortly after Louisiana opened its penitentiary, there were articles written in newspapers in other states in the South praising the penitentiary and suggesting that slave owners kind of learn from the penitentiary system. It was kind of the frontier of a new type of forced labor in the South. It was industrial, and they suggested that slave owners use women and children to work on cotton mills instead of out in the fields where they were maybe not as productive. When I was going through all this research, I was I wondered if the Civil War hadn't happened when it did, if slavery had lasted longer, would it have kind of shifted in the direction of what the form that was in the penitentiaries once the South had kind of industrialized more. Texas, a lot of states followed Louisiana's lead, and Texas opened its, a few years after it opened its penitentiary, it was the largest factory in the state. And it was actually the largest supplier of textiles west of the Mississippi. And this time was really, in the South, it was really a boom time, especially in Louisiana. New Orleans was was on its way to surpassing New York as the country's economic capital. It had the largest concentration of banks in the country, the largest slave market. The frontier was constantly expanding and opening up more land for cotton. So northern investors, European investors were pumping money into the state. It was very easy to get a loan, and then the bubble burst and the economy collapsed. America went through its first Great Depression, and this is in 1837. And like today, Louisiana, after the bubble kind of burst, the penitentiary was not making money for the state. It was a burden. And like today, one of the targets for belt tightening was the prison. So the state privatized the prison. Shortly after this happened, the conditions rapidly got worse. I found a memoir of a prisoner who had been there at the time, and he talks about, it's very similar to things you hear today, that the people running the prison dropped any kind of attempt at rehabilitating inmates, and it was all about profit. And you have to understand this time was the idea of the penitentiary is new, and the idea of it was based on the notion that people would be rehabilitated through labor. But there was no evidence. The penitentiary existed for about 30 years in the country. There's no evidence to support this. There was still high crime rates. But at this point, it almost didn't matter. Louisiana, by 1857 was making the modern day equivalent of $1.2 million in profit from its penitentiary. That was about $4,000 per inmate per year. So they were hooked. They were hooked on this kind of this mode of punishment because they were making money from it.